Okay. So.
Thanks to David and everybody at Ilsley Library for being such a great host for the First Wednesday series in Middlebury. As you may know, as Chris said, this program happens across the entire state of Vermont. This is one of 9 sites. So this evening, in other communities where there are other speakers and Vermonters of all ages are gathered to learn about different topics, discuss different topics, including this evening alone, Latin American poetry, a performance lecture on how the Negro spiritual grew out of slaves' experiences, contemporary poets who continue to use rhyme and meter and other formalist devices, the impact of the interstate highway system on Vermont, an author named, who wrote a wonderful book called Letters to Jackie, Condolences from a Grieving Nation. Taking a look at what those archives looked like. Poetry's a language of spirituality, looking particularly at the poetry of Dickinson and Rumi and Kenyon, and a Supreme Court oral argument that saved the Union during the Civil War. Those of you who are familiar with New York City, you might think of First Wednesdays as kind of the 92nd Street Y comes to Vermont. But unlike the 92nd Street Y, these talks are free so that everyone can participate and benefit from them. Those 72 lectures, 9 sites, 8 months of lectures, are just a fraction of what the Humanities Council does. We do about 1,100 programs a year. 1,100 programs a year in 150 towns in all 14 of Vermont's counties. They include programs such as this one for the general public. They also include a wide variety of programs related to literacy, targeted at child care providers, middle school students, adult basic education students, including men and women who are in Vermont's prison system. So the reasons for that are self-evident and hugely compelling. I would say that the Vermont Humanities Council is not part of state government. We're a nonprofit organization, and so we rely on the support of foundations and individuals and other generous hosts. And so I hope that you will not only support your local library, but also support the Vermont Humanities Council. How many of you are not from Middlebury? How many of you do not live in Middlebury?
That's a lot.
It's at least half of you, and that's wonderful. The idea is not that these are regionally based around the state, and that's what makes it so great. It's a real pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. In a certain way, I've been looking forward to this for 22 years. Rob Oden left Dartmouth College, where he's a member of the religion department faculty, just as I began working there. And I heard about this fellow and what a remarkable person and scholar and teacher and fly fisherman he was. He won the first Distinguished Teaching Award at Dartmouth. To win it is one thing, but to be the first one to be chosen says something in addition. Rob Oden is the retired president of Carleton College, the retired president of Kenyon College, and he has also been headmaster of the Hotchkiss School. He taught from 1975 to 1989 at Dartmouth in the religion department. He received a master's in theology and his PhD in Near Eastern languages and literature from Harvard. His chief research interests are in the areas of ancient Near Eastern languages, history, and religion. He's the author of 5 books and scores of scholarly articles and several about fly fishing, another lifelong passion. He serves on a number of nonprofit boards, including being a trustee of the American University in Cairo and the American Schools of Oriental Research. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rob Oden.
Thank you, Peter, for that wonderful and generous introduction. My mother was a high school Latin and English teacher, and she used to give us life lessons that were also grammar lessons. I only realized later that they were also grammar lessons. But she used to say, if when you do an introduction, you're going to err, and that's where that came in, the right pronunciation of ERR. She said, if you're doing an introduction, if you're going to err on the side of generosity. And Peter has done just that, and for that I'm grateful, and I'm at least as grateful to the Vermont Humanities Council. There is also a series going on the humanities and Arab culture, in addition to the Wednesday night and poetry week. We are really lucky. I can't say in this state because I do live in New Hampshire, but in New England we're blessed and fortunate to have an organization doing events like these and others. I love that drive over the mountains, though this is going to end on a less happy note. And it's probably been 6 times in the last 6 months that I've driven either over on 73 or 25, one of the routes, and every time I think, it's impossible to describe what Irene did to the state of Vermont. We may think we know, and we may realize how many people are homeless and how many people's houses are still not rebuilt and how many folks still need clothes, but it's vivid. If you haven't done it recently, and I can see some of you have, it is tough to believe that. Well, I spent years fishing the White River upstream from Rochester when it was not a whole lot wider than this, you know, and it looked like the Missouri for a few days. So I hope we continue to do all we can for our neighbors. I'm conscious, I'm hyper conscious of the potential misleading character, and inevitably so, of titles. Titles are got to be brief attempts to capture. You know, in the ancient world, they didn't have them. One of the reasons we have difficulty in giving titles to works from antiquity is their titles were the first lines. So we call the thing that was really called Shanachba Emuru, which means he who plumbed the depths. We call it the Epic of Gilgamesh, but they didn't. We call Meinen Aida Thea Ulamenenkai ... the Iliad, but that's not what they called it. They called it Ula. We call Arma Worm Kai Kano, and I could go on. We call Bereshith bara Elohim, the book of Genesis. They called them by their first words, so they didn't have this problem of titles. And I understand, or at least I'm indicting myself in saying religion and identity in the Near East probably says too little and too much. So let me tell you what a longer title might be, and explain openly right now what I'm going to try to discuss this evening. You might better call my title if there were, and of course that's the challenge of titles, to make them brief. Several examples, this would be a longer title, several examples, some divided by thousands of years of religions and identities in the Near and Middle East. So it's more than just what I said. And here's what I aim to talk about tonight. First, how do most of us today in the West, so in Europe and the Americas, how do most of us know what we think we know about the Middle East? What are the sources? What are our chief sources for what we think we know about the Middle East? Secondly, what roles do religions play in the achievement of stable identities for groups and communities? And what happens to those formerly stable groups and communities when religious verities, when religious certainties evaporate, as they did in a particular era about which I'll talk? Thirdly, how do people in the Middle East, and especially Muslims, characterize the march of history from remote antiquity till today, and how is that different from the way most of us in the West are tempted to account for or recount the march of history? And finally, since I'm just back from a month in Egypt and Jordan, days back, and I'm interested in the future of the Middle East and what's going on right now and where the Arab Spring is right now, and I imagine others are too. I want to talk a little bit about what I saw of late and the folks with whom I met and talked of late, and what prospects lie ahead. If there is a lurking kind of negative theme beneath what I'm going to say tonight, it's what I kept thinking in the last 5 weeks, walking at all hours of the night and day the streets of Cairo and Alexandria and Edfu and Aswan and Luxor. And I kept thinking, I am walking, and I know I'm walking, in about as safest place there is on earth. Every corner I'm met by people offering me directions in Arabic, because I do a bit of that, or English, and often offering me tea. All hours unplanned and planned. I'm walking everywhere, as I always have, in a part of the world where a lot of us in the West would be afraid to go and would think this must be a place of danger and foreboding, and it's just the opposite. And why? So there is still this sense of Orientalism, really. There is still this sense for a lot of us that over there is the other. And that over there that is the other is the different and the unknown, and therefore they're potentially frightening. And it's not. Now, before I seem to be unfairly accusing any of you of being irrationally afraid, there are some places in Cairo, like there are in every place in the world, where it's not smart to go. Right? For much of the last 15 months, hanging out in Tahrir Square, the site of the demonstrations, was on some occasions not a good place to be. I hung out there several Fridays last autumn, and it was fine. In fact, if you ask me my single memory, it was the Egyptian children dressed in Egyptian flags. I mean, this was children, for the first time in their lives, immensely proud to be Egyptians and immensely proud of what Egypt was doing right now. And it's reflecting on my own time in college, which I share with one of my colleagues who's nicely here tonight. When we were in college and revolting, our parents were disgusted. Right? When we were in college and revolting in the 60s and the 70s, our parents were largely embarrassed or angry or disgusted. It's just the opposite in Egypt. The parents are immensely proud of what their children have done and keep asking themselves, why didn't we do this ourselves 30 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years ago? So to be sure, there are places that are not as safe as they might be, but statistically and every other way, there is no city on the face of the earth remotely the size of Cairo that is remotely as safe as is Cairo. And most of us don't think that. Why? So that's one of the background questions that I'm trying to entertain tonight. Having said that, I'm talking about both the Near East and the Middle East. Let me explain to you one of the most common differences between those terms. And they're chronological, not geographical. Okay? So normally the term Near East means what you and I would call the Fertile Crescent, everything from, say, Libya to southern Iraq, as it existed from remote antiquity up to the time of the founding of Islam in the 6th and 7th centuries AD, or the first two Islamic centuries. That same part of the world, since the beginning of the foundation of Islam, we call the Middle East. So there's no geographical difference. It's not where does one start and when does the other begin, it's when. So since an awful lot of my own training and background was epigraphical and crawling in and out of tombs, the first part of my talk is going to be more related to antiquity, to the Near East, and I make no apology. I just want you to know that we're covering lots of decades and centuries and even millennia tonight, and I'm going to start back there. Without fail, since I do and did crawl in and out of tombs a lot, and I've just been doing that a lot in the last month, when I taught courses like this at Dartmouth, towards the end of the course, an undergraduate would come to my office hours, and I would talk about the things that I'd been doing in class, and he or she would say, "You know, Professor, do you know that you remind all of us in class a whole lot of Indiana Jones?" And I would think, that is so wildly improbable, so ferociously implausible that I love it. Right? And then I thought, well, so here's another chance for a life lesson. So I would say to students, students, there's something you should know about flattery. It generally works. And that led to my formulating one of my, I work, and my colleague Jay is vastly better than I am at this, but I work on shaping bromides or aphorisms or pithy sayings. And I've got a couple dozen of them. And one of them that came out of that experience goes as following: the human capacity for self-deception is limitless. And I fell for it, and I'm sure would again. So let me begin by talking about how we know what we think we know about the Middle East or the Near East. And this is going to begin with examples from antiquity, but my argument is going to be that this stuck. That how we know what we think we knew about the Middle East, even if some of the sources from this are thousands of years ago, stuck with us for a long time. And let me tell you first why this is an issue. And I'll just pick Egypt as an example. For 1,500 years, all of our knowledge about ancient Egypt was mediated through other sources, which I'm going to talk about. Okay, now, all historical knowledge is mediated We learn a whole lot about Gibbon and a little bit about Rome in Gibbon's history of the decline of Rome. It's always mediated through sources and historians and historiography, but it's unusually so in the case of the ancient Near East because we didn't know how to read those languages for most of 2,000 years. The last Egyptian inscription in hieroglyphic Egyptian, in ancient Egyptian, comes from 394 AD, and it's in an Isis temple on the island of Philae, just upstream from Aswan, and I was reading it within the last fortnight. This is cute little inscription from 394, and it's the last one. Between then and about 1825, we didn't know how to read Egyptian, and all our guesses were wrong. We thought it was entirely pictographic. Right? A little picture of a guy must be the word for guy. A little picture of some feet running is probably the word running. And they're laughably, hilariously wrong-headed were our translations of ancient Egyptian until you know the story of the Rosetta Stone and the rest of it. But in that interim period, and still affecting us today, I would argue, how we know what we think we know about the ancient Near East chiefly came from two sources. First, Herodotus, Hecataeus of Abdera, and other Greek historians of the ancient Near East, all of whom argued and alleged that they had visited the countries about which they wrote. I have argued brazenly or foolhardily in print that none of them actually did visit the places about which they wrote, that Herodotus' account of Persia and of Egypt is basically based on sailor stories. And sailors back then were like sailors now. They're notorious for drinking their way around the Mediterranean. And as they fetched up on the shores near Athens, they told these interesting stories about the Near East, and Herodotus bought them. And what's Herodotus? I'll just pick him. There are others, Hecataeus, Diodorus, and others, Strabo later on. What's his portrait of it? It's the land of civilization gone overboard, hyper-civilized, over-civilized, bizarre activity. It's the place where they got civilization backwards, so they do everything wrong, and just the opposite of what civilized people do. His most vivid example, and forgive me for citing this, but it is Herodotus' most vivid example. It goes as follows: in every other nation on the face of the earth, men urinate standing up and women sitting down. In Egypt and in the rest of the Middle East, women urinate standing up and men sitting down. And then that becomes his trope, his concept, his conceit for all of what ancient Egypt was about. Now, why was he doing that? Because you have to remember, or please remember, that by the 5th or 4th century BC, it was pretty much acknowledged throughout the Mediterranean that there were two great ancient sources of civilization, ancient Egypt and Greece. And Herodotus did not want to lose that battle. And he couldn't say, we're older than they, and he couldn't say we're more civilized than they, even though we've got the Parthenon and Homer and pretty soon the dramatists. So what he did say is they too are civilized, but it's civilization gone soft and flabby and wrong-headed, so that Egyptian women act the way they do, and you ought to understand that that's not real civilization at all. It's a hyper-civilization that really is barbaric kind of behavior. Similarly, the other source, again, even if you have never read the Hebrew Bible, for most of us in the West, the other source of our information about the ancient Near East comes from the Hebrew Bible. And what's Egypt in the Hebrew Bible? It's the land from which we escaped, thank God. It's the land where the people were so over-civilized and flabby that they couldn't give birth on their own and needed help. It's the land where the soldiers dressed up in fancy uniforms and marched in formation so that we could hide behind the bushes and beat the pants off them. And that last example I worded the way I did by design, because I know you know this, but let me remind you that the model for the way in which we in America talk about our defeat of the British is exactly the Egypt-Israel story. Okay? The new pharaoh is Elizabeth I or Charles I or James I instead of Ramses II. The new Red Sea is the Atlantic Ocean. We're now the rough and ready, hardy colonials hiding behind every bush, beating the pants off the redcoats. But that's all based on this ancient story. So even if today we might be willing to say, yes, I understand that a whole lot of civilization as we know it, all the civilizing gifts, writing, monumental architecture, other things I'll talk about later tonight, came from the Middle East, but it was a kind of foundational base level, and we're way beyond that and pretty well rid of that. So that's example number one, how we know what we think we know about the Middle East, and it's to say that it's mediated, and it's mediated through sources, both of which are fighting battles. Secondly, an example from a particular era on what happens when all the verities, all the truths, all the what we think we know about religions change. And the example I'm choosing is the Hellenistic era. And when and what the Hellenistic era is may be perfectly at the tip of all of your tongues, or it may not be. So let me err on the side of the latter and make sure you know what we're talking about. Okay, this is not Hellenic. Hellenic civilization is classic Greek civilization. Homer, Herodotus, Plato, the Parthenon. That's classic Greek civilization from, say, the beginning of the Iron Age, 1200 to 400 or 500 BC. In the 19th century, historians needed a term to describe the era between the end of Hellenic civilization and the beginning of the Roman Empire, and they called it the Hellenistic era. So Hellenistic is not Hellenic. The istic means that stuff, that period, and that religion and art and the rest of it that sits between ancient Greek civilization in its classical form and the beginning of the Roman Empire. So we're talking about the dates, obviously, between Alexander the Great's conquest of the Middle East in about 330 and whose defeat at the Battle of Actium in 30. Okay? Cleopatra and Antony's defeat at the hands of Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus, in 30 BC. So that 300 years between 330 and 30 BC we call the Hellenistic era. And what happened? What happened was that Alexander the Great's bringing of Greek civilization to the Near East produced an extraordinary, fruitful, and unpredictably productive mixture or amalgamation or syncretism of Greek thought and religion with Near Eastern thought and religion. And it was fruitful, and it was interesting, and it just knocked everybody asunder. We thought we knew what the world was about. I'm in Egypt, I'll pick that example. I worship Amun and Osiris and Atum and Horus and Isis and all these old deities, and now you're telling me there's a whole new set of deities that are half those people and half Greeks. And I'm going to give you 4 or 5 examples now and then tell you how I've worked with students to make some sense of these. If you look at voices from that era, the era when Greek culture meets Near Eastern culture and produces a whole set of new different things, what you hear voices saying is, I've never in my life lived through, or even heard of anyone living through such rapid, unparalleled change. Nothing has stayed the same of late. You'll hear people saying, on every front there's uncertainty. I used to know who the gods were, but now there are old gods and new gods combined with old gods and new names for old gods, and I'm not sure who's running the cosmos. We hear of magic and fate and fortune, and especially there's a whole new assault of fatalism in this era. The world is so confusing and changing so quickly that I'm going to put my fate in the hands of the goddess Fortuna, the god fate, the god fortune. It doesn't matter what I do, one way or another anyway. I might as well throw my fate in the hands of pure fatalism. We hear, and I'm not making this up, of a new globalism, of constant, rootless, heretofore unknown travel, with the verities of all known places and spaces giving way to the puzzles of peoples and foods and religions and architectures completely unknown before. I assembled, in the winter of 2008, I took 32 college students to Egypt for the winter term. And speaking of doing something bizarre in Egypt, trying to run a college while you're teaching 32 students for the winter term in Egypt was on the edge of the bizarre. I assembled at one point, and it's of course about everything in Egypt, from remotest antiquity to yesterday, a collection of quotations from this era, and asked the students to guess when they came from. What's the setting of these quotations? The 2 most popular guesses were World War II and immediately post-war existentialism and Camus. This sounds like that, or a book or an editorial by Tom Friedman. Right? These must have come out of The Lexus and the Olive Tree or The World is Flat. Okay? And it didn't. It came out of an era thousands of years before that, but with the same kind of dislocations. And I want to tell you what I'm making of this in a moment, but if you want an entree into this world, and at the same time you want to read the best novel by far from antiquity, you want to read Apuleius' The Golden Ass. Apuleius is a 2nd century novelist who wrote about a person wandering around the Mediterranean in this era. I assigned it to my students in 2008. They said, oh, gosh, what? Here we are in Egypt, and we've been given this 400-page novel, and then they couldn't stop reading it. It reads like it was written yesterday. Apuleius' The Golden Ass, and that's what it's about. It's about a hero who gets lost and transformed into something else and gives up hope and keeps turning to fatalism and magic and sorcery and anything until the last pages of the book he's rescued by the goddess Isis, who comes upon the scene and restores him to salvation. My point in talking about this era is, my points are the following. Number one, the role that religion plays in cementing social and community identity. Once confident adherents of ancient Egyptian religions, followers of Horus and Amun and the like, lost their confidence and became ever more confused by the baffling array of new religions sold on every corner in the new religious marketplace. Secondly, that this very uncertainty, the loss of who I am and what I thought I knew about myself and the world and what makes sense in the light of this new globalism, led to what I will call the rapid rise of a whole new category of religions, of redeemer of religions. So previous religions had talked about the goal of the life and what you ought to aim to do in this life and how to make yourself a better person and how to make life better. In this era, in the middle of this confusion, there arose a set of redeemer religions that said there is no ultimate satisfaction in this life. If you want a goal in life, it's to be lifted out of this tawdry, dirty, soiled, unattractive, and unsatisfying life and lifted into the true truths of heaven. I have written about this era and called what I've written about it the religious marketplace of late antiquity. And I use that metaphor by design. If you're at a street corner in Damascus, Tarsus, Alexandria, Athens, Rome in this era, and there are 4 corners in this intersection, on one of the corners there's an evangelist touting the advantages of Isis, the Egyptian goddess, and another one, somebody talking about the Syrian goddess, who is a goddess in what you and I would call the edge of Syria and Iraq, who combines the characteristics of a lot of ancient goddesses into one. On another corner, there'd be someone talking about the goddess fate or fortune, and on a 4th corner pretty soon, of course, there's an evangelist talking about another redeemer religion, the religion of Christianity. If you had asked me, well, if I were a betting person, and I've never bought a lottery ticket, and even though I picked Kentucky and Baylor, I bet on neither one of them. If you'd asked me, so you're in 100 AD, who's going to win this competition? I'd have said, I don't want to take your money. That's such an easy bet. Isis, 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 Isis. If I've got 5 guesses, they're Isis, 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 and Isis. She was a goddess, and goddesses were head and shoulders the most favored deities in this period. She had the greatest claim to remote antiquity, and that mattered a lot. Which one of these deities was worshipped the longest ago? She was particularly known for her miracles, for curing people blind, and especially people born blind. And she was most particularly Louis Zamperini, and who's read Unbroken? Right, needed Isis. She was particularly known for providing fresh water to people marooned in boats in salt water, like Laura Hill and Brandt's Louis Zamperini. So she would have won, and I would have been wrong, because obviously she didn't. Now, the question of why one religion succeeds and another fails is an immensely complicated one, and to give religious adherents their due, a Christian would say, well, Christianity won because it's true. So you don't have to ask who won this competition and what's the answer to that. It's true, and I have to respect that. That's a good, solid, inline answer. If you asked a scholar of religion like me, why did Christianity win? I think I would say because it had the most pronounced and most profound ethical center. That something that was missing in some of these religions that did not win out, as did Christianity, was that accent upon not not salvation by whim or salvation by happening upon ISIS, but rather upon one's own ethical behavior. Third topic, how do we, this is going to get into more of Christianity as opposed to Islam, and especially Islam. Well, anything like an introduction to Islam, I'm sure not pretending to offer tonight. How do we in the West, Europe, the Americas, tend to think of history as marching, and how does that contrast with Muslims? Okay. Here's a truncated, laughably abbreviated version of the march of history for most of us in the West. Well, it began with the Fertile Crescent, with those ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians and others, and they gave us these great gifts of civilization, like the first writing systems. Not only the first writing systems, by the way, but something immensely more democratizing, the first alphabets. And so I spent years of my life memorizing Akkadian signs, cuneiform signs, and Egyptian hieroglyphs, because you have to. Turns out that any of us can memorize an alphabet in a couple of hours. So once you get an alphabet, literacy goes from 5% to 55% overnight. So it's a huge advantage for civilization once the alphabet is invented by the Phoenicians and then the Israelites and then others. The first law codes come from the ancient Near East. The first monumental architecture comes from the ancient Near East. The first schools that we know about come from the ancient Near East. The first collections of proverbs and advice literature, sort of ancient equivalent of Tish Baldridge's How to Behave at a Cocktail Party. That kind of stuff came from the ancient Near East. And we would say that's what happened then. And then that gave rise to the glory of Greece and Rome. Wow. Which was followed by Byzantine culture, which is pretty good. It's Greek and Roman culture Christianized after Constantine the Great in the 4th century, but it's still pretty good. And then there were 5 or 6 sort of puzzling, nasty, negligible, tawdry centuries that we don't know what to call, so we'll sort of call them the Dark Ages, until, thank God, this Western culture was reborn in the period we call the Reborn, by the Renaissance, followed by the Enlightenment and the discovery of science, and then the Industrial Revolution, now the triumph of the West. And what's the Muslim version? The Muslim version is that 5 centuries of darkness is the pivot of history. That's when everything changed. That's when Islam was born. In 622 AD, you and I would say. That's when Muhammad lived. That's when the revelations, the real revelations, the ones that completed the incomplete ones in the Hebrew Bible and New Testaments, were given to Muhammad. That's when Arab culture did an astonishingly quick, and back to this I'm going to come before I finish, conquest of the globe. Think of it, Muhammad dies in 632, and in 641 Cairo is Islamic. 9 years after he dies in what you and I would call Saudi Arabia, Cairo is Islamic, and a few years later so is Baghdad and most of the Mediterranean, and all that algebra and all that culture and all that mathematics. That was the height of history as we know it. And the problem is Islam has that view of history and saw one success after another, and the world was on the verge of becoming Islam, and it didn't. So history for the last 4 or 5 centuries in the Islamic view has been going the wrong way. What looked like a smashing, ever-increasing global conquest by Islam is now given way to the culture of the infidel. Rock music and inappropriate clothing. That's what's now taken over, and it's wrong and it's humiliating. So the reason I talked about history and religion and identities in stressing this point is just that. A big part of the Islamic identity is what history was during that period that we call the Dark Ages, and what it was meant to do and what happened. And having mentioned that Muhammad died in 632, my most telling single example of the difference between Christianity and Islam is what happened next. So Muhammad, the messenger of God, the one according to whom Muslims got the message right, uncorrupted, and all the others got the message corrupted, got it right, was born in about 570 and dies in 632 and is succeeded by his companion Abu Bakr. And that was great for Sunnis. Sunnis think he was the right successor, and that's great. Shi'i Muslims, by the way, think it ought to have been a relative of Muhammad's, and that's the basis of that disagreement. And what is, according to Islamic tradition, what are Abu Bakr's first words when he leaves the tent in which Muhammad has died. And his first words were, "For all of you who have worshipped Muhammad, Muhammad is dead. Allah is the ever-living God." So contrast that with the end of the Gospels. Right? The death of Jesus makes the world shake in Christianity. The death of Muhammad in Islam is he's dead. We always told you he was going to be dead. Allah is the ever-living God. When I was an undergraduate, I took a year-long course in comparative religion. There was about 6 weeks devoted to Islam, and we had a quiz at the end of every week on which always, every time, there was an extra credit question at the end, which I got wrong the first time, so did everybody else, and we got right every time after that because we learned. And the extra credit question was, Muhammad is blank, blank, blank. So, first time again, Muhammad is a middle-class Saudi Arabian businessman who was pretty normal until he was 40, and then he had an encounter with the angel Gabriel. And Muhammad is the founder of Islam, and Muhammad is the biggest proponent of the most clearly monotheistic religion in the world. Wrong, wrong, wrong. No extra credit. The answers that the instructor wanted were human, human, and human. So the answer to the extra credit question is Muhammad is human, human, and human. If you want an analogy to Jesus, it's not Muhammad, it's the Quran. So the Quran is the infleshed Word of God for Muslims, as Jesus is the incarnate Word of God for Christians. So, and forgive me for saying the obvious, but when you read about how deeply upset Muslims are when a Quran is mistreated, burned, whatever, don't think of a book. Think of the incarnate Word of God, because that's what it is. That's why you have to learn Arabic to be a Muslim. It can't be translated. It's the thing itself. So that as a sidelight to the central point that the early success of Islam did not last and happened in that very period when most of us in the West, a period that most of us in the West characterize as a kind of unpleasant and eminently forgettable era. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about, and I'm hoping to leave plenty of time for questions, about the Middle East today. And I'm enough of a scholar that truth in advertising makes me want to tell you that I spent an awful lot of time in the Middle East, and again of late, but I'm not a development economist, and I'm not a political scientist, and I'm certainly no prophet. The last time I ever spoke when I was a Dartmouth professor was May 29th, 1989, and it was in a talk not unlike this, and somebody from the audience said, the Ayatollah Khomeini is sick. Do you fear for his life? And I said, oh, no. His brother's still alive, 10 years older. He'll be around for 20 years, and the next day he was dead. So my prophetic abilities are negligible, and there's plenty of evidence for that. First, what I want to say is, from the standpoint of the sociology of religion, the study of how do religions grow and what happens to them, there's all kinds of hope for moderate mainline Islam, and there is for the following reason. If you ask yourself in the history of religion, as a student of comparative religion, how do religions grow and what happens to them? It's basically they begin as sects and cults divorced from society. There's an outburst of charismatic activity or something like that leads people to found a new religion. And you name the religion, any of the ones that you and I remember, and they exist that way for quite a while. But inevitably, and if they're going to succeed at all, in the decades and then centuries that follow, they have to accommodate themselves to normal, commercial, economic, social intercourse, or they're not going to make it as religions. Great example, Christianity. Christianity, St. Paul writes in his letters, he's still, like lots of the authors in the New Testament, expecting the second coming soon. Expecting the world's on the wane and it's going to end before long, and that's one of the reasons he urges celibacy on people. And he's not worried about generations to come, because like everybody in that era, they thought that the second coming was upon them. This same religion, 4 centuries later, has bishops and popes and churches and cathedrals. It's gone the way that religions go. If there is a single lesson from the sociology of religion, it is that religions have to accommodate themselves to the world or they cease to exist. They don't accommodate themselves to the world as fringe cults, they will not exist. And as that has happened, as Sects and cults have assimilated themselves to routinized, bureaucratic, middle-class, bourgeois life. The same thing, I think, is going to happen to Islam, and that's one of the reasons that there is hope for the future, and lest I alone appear to be the one arguing this. Here's a very recent quotation from a French scholar called Gilles Capel, which I'm translating here. Before us, here in France, he's arguing, lies the prospect that a new generation of Muslim thinkers will emerge, men and women with a universalist perspective, free from the straitjacket of authoritarianism and corruption, emancipated from the subservience towards their rulers, emancipated from the rage of rebellion which endorses jihad, excommunication, and violence. There are promising currents of modernism and reformist Islamic thought in Europe, thought that seeks assimilation, not only with European societies, but also with Western values of individual human and political rights. Bingo. It's going to assimilate itself to mainline activity, or it will not survive, and that's certainly true in the history of religions. Two final examples, these more based upon anecdote than scholarship, but they're recent. A part of the reason I was just a month in Egypt is that I'm still a trustee of the American University in Cairo, and I loved the statement on behalf of the Vermont Humanities Council, so I'll say another one. If you don't know to whom to give your philanthropic dollars, the American University in Cairo is a likely candidate, especially because there is no better time in the history of the world for American foreign aid to be going to the Middle East right when we've cut it. Right now, if you want to do something meaningful in the Middle East, you'd support education in Egypt, and education in Syria, and education in Yemen, and education in Libya. And it's in the same era where getting any dollars freed for that has become impossible. So one of the reasons I was in Egypt related is I'm in charge of a trustee group trying to figure out how to fix the finances of the American University in Cairo, because they, like everything else in Egypt, has been a huge victim of the revolution. Whatever you think of the Egyptian revolution, the thing that started on January 28th of 2011, has been devastating for foreign investment, devastating for the Egyptian economy, and especially devastating for the universities like the American University in Cairo, which depend upon international students who are now staying home. So I was meeting with a lot of people, not necessarily people of wealth, though some of them were, a lot of people who made a difference in their communities, from Alexandria in the north to Aswan in the south. And without independent consultation, their statements were stunningly similar, and they went like this. Change is tough. Big change is really tough. Change after what we've lived under since Nasser, after the Free Officers' Revolt in 1952, and then Sadat, and then Mubarak, is virtually impossible, and yet that's what we're doing. And right now my business is shot all to heck because of this. To a woman who just opened a department store 18 months ago, and she's just declared bankruptcy. It's because people just aren't buying right now in Egypt. But she said, that's what's happened to my business, but I have to tell you, I completely support the Egyptian revolution. We're suffering now so that our children can vote and our grandchildren can vote and can run and win seats in parliament. To some of us here, the big stakes, the big question in the Egyptian revolution, Egyptian election last fall might have seemed trivial. The key question was, should we have a new constitution or not? You were also asked to vote for an interim parliament, which now is in action until. But the big question was, a new constitution or not? And it won overwhelmingly. And we might be tempted to say, of course it did. This was the first unrigged election in at least 40 years in Egypt. I used to ask people in Egypt over and over again, did you vote? And they would laugh and they'd say, no. I say, have you ever voted? And I say, no, why should I vote? It doesn't matter at all. There's nothing to the voting. Everybody voted this last time, everybody meaning 70%. A huge percent of the people suddenly voted, and a huge percent of the people have hope. And when I then said, but yeah, how about the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis and the Wahhada, and there's some things to worry about, aren't there? Again, with unanimity, they said, I'll try not to betray more than I show right now, well, do the people you vote for always get elected in the U.S.? And I said, no, they often don't. I said, well, does that cause you to despair? And I said, no, I don't like it. I wish that hadn't happened, but that's what this is. So that some people with whom we disagree may get elected, but the march of democracy is impossible to stop right now. So you shouldn't worry and you shouldn't panic. We're going to be okay. I'm enormously optimistic. There will be more demonstrations in Tahrir Square, and some of them may be violent. With elections, there may be some more violence. There are going to be strikes, and they're going to be accompanied by nastiness. But in the long term, and by the way, thank God, this is at once the most important, the most populous nation in the Middle East or North Africa, wherever you call it, Egypt, and the one that we most often neglect. We tend to pay the most, not economically, to be sure, and we do that, but we pay a lot more attention to some of the more difficult places than we do that place where we're in their lives the last hope. And last anecdote. When I had with me 32 Carleton students, and they could have been students at Middlebury or Pomona or Dartmouth or anywhere. I don't mean to accent where they happen to be from, but 32 students with me in Egypt. Even though I said to them, please explore and go everywhere, I didn't have to say that. These are undergraduates. I mean, they were everywhere. First morning, I'd been there a week, and they showed up, and I said, you guys look tired. I made sure your planes got here at 7 o'clock last night. Why are you tired? And, well, we found a Palestinian jazz cafe, and it didn't close till 5 a.m. So we just got here from there. Well, they did just what they should have done. It's exactly what they should have done. That's how they're really learning. And we were sharing stories with one another the last afternoon before we all went home. And one young woman the last week, it wasn't the day before, had hung out in a Cairo coffee house, like Naguib Mahfouz, the Dickens of Egypt, the famous Egyptian, now late author. If you've never read Medoc Alley or any of Naguib Mahfouz's novels, I certainly recommend them to you. She spent the afternoon hanging out in a coffee house and got in a deep and interesting conversation with a Muslim man, and got to feel comfortable enough with him that towards the end of the conversation she said, so you're a Muslim? And he said, oh yeah. And she said, well, I've been learning about Islam with the rest of my classmates this term, and I know everybody has to pray 5 times a day, so where do you pray when you're praying 5 times a day? And he said, oh, I don't. She said, you don't? Well, who does? And he said, well, I don't know, maybe 1 out of 100 Egyptians. Some people do, but a lot of us don't. And she said, well, do you go to a mosque on Friday? And he said, every once in a while. The Islamic equivalent of Easter or Christmas in your calendar, I show up a couple times a year. And she said, well, do you believe? And again, this is all from her. He said, well, sometimes, but a lot of times I don't. I struggle a lot with faith. And she said, and forgive me, but it's a quote from her. She said, oh my God, you're just like we are. That's the thesis of my lecture. Oh my God, you're just like we are. Thank you all very much. So the questions are not who won the Battle of Actium, which you all know now is not Cleopatra and Mark Antony, but rather Octavian, who became Caesar. But about anything I said or didn't say that has to, well, if I don't know, I'll surely tell you. But I'd love to try to respond to some queries or comments.
Why did Constantine back Christianity?
Question is, why did Constantine back Christianity? I'll give you a preface, if I may, and then I'll tell you why I think he backed Christianity. I was asked by a newspaper in Connecticut about 10 years ago to write an editorial about how the real message of Christianity has been lost. And I wrote the editorial, and it said, the real message of Christmas, excuse me, why has the real message of Christmas been lost? And I wrote the editorial saying it hasn't. Christmas was born to compete with Roman festivals economically. The origins of Christmas are overwhelmingly economic. 3rd or 4th century A.D., bourgeois middle-class Mediterranean is becoming Christian. You know, we have this notion, because it was true early that Christianity was a religion of the poor, and it was, to be sure, a religion of the poor also, but it really caught on with the middle class. So I would say by the 4th century, it's pretty clear in the eyes of Constantine and others that this is the route that's going to succeed.
Muslim. And I've heard people, Muslims, American Muslims, interviewed, who have said that they feel, and they've discussed with other fellow American Muslims, that America is one of the best countries in the world in which to be a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested to know what your response to that observation might be, and whether or not you think it's partially accurate and partially sort of egotistical on our part to say something like that.
Yeah, it's an extremely, I'd never heard that particular comment. That was an extremely interesting, and I would say discerning, and probably your last comment I'll ultimately agree with, partly accurate and part. Again, with some prefaces or two. The first mosque, well, a mosque only needs to be a place where you can see, where there's an indication of where the Qibla is, the direction of prayer towards Mecca. So this room could become a mosque if we had, that must be south, vaguely, right? So if there was something pointing southeast towards Mecca like that, and that direction is called Qibla, this could be a mosque. The first American purpose-built mosque, not a room like this turned into one, the first building that was built as a mosque was built in the middle of Iowa. That by way of saying that there's been Islam in the U.S. a lot longer than many of us tend to think. Well, you know, the Arabic word for city is Medina or Medina, but it's Medina. And how many states have a Medina or a Medina? Most of them do. So there's plenty of this. And I was talking to some people at dinner, and I'll say something I want to modify a little bit because I think it's a little bit too simple. But the question is, what do Egyptians today think of Americans? And if you ask them that, the answer is, we love Americans. And then they'll say, it's American policy we hate. Now, that's interesting, except that that's pretty typical. I mean, I don't find that, it's okay, it's not much of a revelation. I think you and I would say that about Iranians. Hard not to like Iranians, but geez, I don't think much of Iranian policy right now. But there is an awful lot of regard for America as the place of democracy. And this precedes the Egyptian Revolution. The place where you can go and be the freest, we think, as far as we know, is the U.S. So the habit of allowing people to practice their own religion in many ways has peaked here. And I say that actually chauvinistically because we often get a hard time. And I understand that, but I tell you, compared with a lot of other places in the world, it's pretty easy to practice the kind of religion, thank God, you want to in this country. So I think it's easy to be a Muslim because there are centers of Islamic population density like Detroit, but that's not the only one that are. For many of the reasons that I talked about earlier in my lecture, it's not in that it's so widely misunderstood a religion. Now, that too doesn't place it alone. I mean, I was once at a comparative religious conference in an interesting part of the world where a bunch of Hindus were being introduced to Christianity. They didn't know anything about it, and they couldn't believe what they were hearing. You know, I mean, in the U.S., we're used to a lot of Jewish and Christian themes, so it doesn't seem to us unusual, but it sure did to them. You know, what? And go over that story again, imagining you had never heard it before. And I'm not being either pro or anti-Christian. I'm just saying, if you'd never heard it, it seemed, and that actually is precisely what St. Paul would say. It's the foolishness of God. Of course it seems foolish, precisely because it's not. So there is a very pointed and strong defense of that within Christianity. But it is still the case that it's easy to misunderstand Islam. That for a long time, you know, the Saracen, the heretic par excellence for the West was the Muslim. So you went to Jerusalem not just to save the holy places and save the whole city, but because it was in the hands of that group, than whom it's hard to imagine a more difficult one. And you know, I'm going to... This last time in Egypt, I kept trying to think, because one does see more and more women veiled, and especially fully veiled with just a slit. Remember, I mean, I don't know this, but in some cases I've seen it in very proper context. Remember that there's jeans and a sweater under that. I mean, you know, and you can look at this and think that is the exotic. Well, it is on the outside, but it's not. There's nothing exotic. They're just like us underneath. But that exotic tag. Finally, and to be both fair and critical of Islam, jihad means the obligation of Muslims to come to the defense of Islam when it's under attack. So strictly speaking, jihad is that. Intellectually, mostly when it was first formulated. When Islam was attacked as an inauthentic religion, as an opponent of Judaism and Christianity, the obligation of jihad meant the intellectual need to defend Islam, and hence that elaborate production of 4 schools of Sunni Islam in what we would call the medieval period. But jihad can also mean physical violence, and it has meant that a lot. And so whether it's in the name of Islam inauthentically or not, religions are powerful forces that tap extremely powerful social, psychological, psychic roots. And there isn't a one of them that's incapable of doing some pretty vile things. And we tend to think of that especially. But as it happens, most of the Egyptians whom I know would agree with if it's your brother-in-law, with that statement, that they feel pretty comfortable in the U.S. as Muslims. Please.
You made a big point that 1,200 years or so ago that the Muslim world was really the center of intellectual life and culture and the world, or with the possible exception of China. But that's
Yes, exactly, right.
But how did we go from there to a Muslim world today where so much of it is dominated by fundamentalism that rejects culture and intellectual achievement and doesn't value the achievements that their own culture made 1,000 years ago?
There's an editorial in Al-Ahram. Al-Ahram means the pyramids, but it's also the name of the chief newspaper in Cairo. When I was there, by a leading Muslim intellectual saying, the rule of law, rationality, those were all part of our culture only 1,200 years ago. We got to get back to them. So first I'm saying, you're right. That was true then, and there are plenty of people who can claim that that's the authentic core of Islam. The closest I'd come to an answer is an extension of what I said, a humiliation of modernity. The world was advancing in one way, and Islam was a part of the civilizing advance. And then it gave way to the culture of the infidel, to the West and Christianity and the Enlightenment and all. And humiliated people rarely react well. I remember when I was a teacher thinking, when I was a full-time teacher, the old sort of Mr. Arnold rugby school way was to throw erasers at kids when they gave the wrong answer. And I thought, that can't be right, because that's only going to humiliate people, and people don't learn well when they're humiliated. Well, I don't think civilizations learn well when they're humiliated. It's a very profound question to which I don't think any of us has a profound answer. So what I'm going to end by saying is you're right. I agree with you. That is what has happened. Do you have an answer to it?
Oh, no, sorry. I'm just remarking because I had comments.
Good. So go ahead, please.
No, it's just a comment. When you started by saying that, they're like us, and you just made it an allusion to Iran, there's a film playing at the Roxy in Burlington right now called A Separation, and it just won the Oscar for Best Foreign Film. It is so wonderful. It is so wonderful, and all the way through it, I just kept thinking, this is what the Iranian people are like. This is what they're struggling with every day. It's a completely accessible story of a couple who maybe want to separate, but it's complicated by an older gentleman in the family. It is a wonderful, wonderful film. And when you were just saying about, Islam having fallen apart, I don't even want to think what people abroad are thinking when they see, the Republican convention thing. Rick Santorum, hello. I would because this film is available, an hour up the road.
Right.
I would really encourage people to go and see it.
Thank you for that comment. Yes, back there, please.
Were there any moments or situations you could share with us where you realized that the Arab Spring was going to be something real and so incredibly powerful? Were there any moments when that really hit you, that this was something that could change the Arab world?
Question is to make sure we all heard, was there a moment or were there some moments when I thought, gee, the Arab Spring is going to be real? Boy, would I love to make some up. But the truth is, no. I didn't think it was going to happen, or I thought it would happen, but it would take 30 years. I had no idea that beginning with the Tunisian self-immolation and then the quickness, the swiftness with which it made its way to Cairo, and the overnight way in which January 25th turned to January 28th in Cairo. 25th is protest and peaceful, and 28th is violent and of course fed the revolution in a good way. I like this last question. It's so thoughtful. I have no prepared answer for that. The same people I was meeting with in the last month, I've been meeting with for years, and all of them, I'm sure you know the standard title for Mubarak was the Pharaoh. And like Ramses II succeeded by Seti II, Mubarak is going to be succeeded by his son, and there's nothing. But there was a kind of resignation to it. It's a professorial weakness to recommend books. So let me engage in a professorial weakness. But I love your novel recommendation. I'm sure you've either read or heard of or seen the movie The Yacubian Building. So one way to gain access to what this was like before the revolution is a book called The Yacubian Building, but a better one is a book by a guy called Ala Al-Aswani called Taxi. So look up Taxi, and I don't like imperatives, to direct it to audiences. If you have a moment in Amazon or something else, look up Taxi. And Taxi is 62 interviews by a taxi from a taxi cab driver of his passengers. And it's endlessly entertaining and both wildly funny and bitingly horrendous. But if there is a note to it, it's its resignation. Egypt has been like this for a long time. We wish it would change. But the only way it's going to change is at the risk of what little economic freedom we have right now, and I'm not willing to take that risk. And I think that was my failure to catch on. I heard and saw and bought in too much to there's too much risk in confronting the Pharaoh face on the way we have. But those are good books, and it's a very good question.
To follow up on the question earlier on what happened to Islam, did the Crusades play a role in that, and to what extent do you think? I
think the Crusades played a big role in that, and to that I alluded when I talked about the Saracens and the infidel. But absolutely, that this period of Arab civilization in many ways ends when this onslaught, probably again economically motivated, at least by anything else, of European leaders goes and does what they do. So yeah, that's another very good answer to that question. Michelle, somebody I know.
Can you touch a little bit about outside of Egypt, how Islam is practiced in some of the other countries? Because I think our filter that we see Islam through is often through Saudi Arabia and some of the more repressive regimes, which is interesting because I just read this history of Islam, which, for those of us who aren't Islamic experts, it's so interesting to see how Muhammad actually loved women, had women around him all the time, didn't make them wear the veil. So sort of what a lot of people are thinking, going back to the basics, isn't what the most fundamental societies like the Saudis are doing. But what's your perspective on how Islam is practiced around the Arab world and other places outside of Egypt? More liberal, I guess.
There's a lot more liberal, mainline, balanced Islam than we often see or we often get. And I probably using the throwaway line, if you hear more bad news than good, because it's more newsworthy. But you are, to be sure, correct. Now, the Salafi means the founders or the first people, so they think they're getting back to the earlier Islam. But you're absolutely right. They're getting back to sort of third century Islam, third generation Islam, a couple of generations after Muhammad, when the rules about veils and the rest of it came up. So, yes, there's plenty of that, and it's as repressive to women as you can imagine. It is. I would guess at most 5% of Egypt, for example, would fit into any of those camps. So other countries, other positions, but it's not what's dominating most North African. And the biggest success story for mainline Islam in the last 20 years is Indonesia, which a lot of people feared would go that direction, and it hasn't. And I don't think it's going to. I think it's past the time. So there's another success. I'm conscious both of wanting to entertain questions but not wanting to take too long. Good.
Couple more.
Okay, good. If there are a couple more, I'd love to try to respond. Thank you.
Picking up on that, you talked about feeling safe in Egypt and that safety. Do you distinguish that between men and women, and or particularly related to North American women college students studying abroad?
Yeah, I felt particularly safe, but after all, I'm a reasonably old guy, and not everybody in Egypt is a reasonably old guy. And how do other people feel? Much of the time I was in Egypt, my wife was with me, and both alone and together we walked all over Cairo. So, and she does not wear a veil. So in personal experience, I can tell you. Now, what did happen when our students were there was lots and lots of behavior that you often see outside of your home country. Scandalously inappropriate remarks to young women. And our students were hissed at. Actually, I think it's very interesting when we had a forgive me, but you asked a good question. This is a real moment. There was a moment about 3 weeks into the course when the women students, who were about 20 of the 32, called an end to things and said, we got to have a kind of confrontation or what's the word when we're confronting someone whom we fear has a drug problem?
Intervention.
An intervention. Thank you. We have to have an intervention. And they talked about the remarks that they'd made and said to the guys, you got to help us. And the guy said, what are we supposed to do? And they said, hang out with us and tell those guys they're jerks. Good to, so there is that kind of behavior. And again, the hissing really bothers me because it sounds so venomous. I guess that's the point of hissing, is that it sounds venomous. But in general, in most neighborhoods in Cairo, I don't think there's much of a difference. No, the difference is not as pronounced as we may think. The world is still a lot easier in a lot of places for men, and that's true in Cairo. But there are plenty of opportunities for women too.
If you look at the sweep of 1,300 years of Islam, where would you put the Reformation, and where would you put their Enlightenment?
I think that's a terrific question. I think right now I put the Reformation. I would say there are efforts right now at something like a Reformation. Let's see if we can't get back to the beginning, away with this interference of inauthentic clerics. They don't have indulgences, but that kind of moment. And let's get back to the beginning. And if they get back farther to the beginning, to get back to Michelle's point than earlier, I think the one enlightenment about which I talked, Cairo and Baghdad, in what we would call the medieval era, is Enlightenment A. I think Enlightenment B is in front of us. I think the rise of science, the conviction that rationality and logic and evidence and proof matter.
The Arab awakening of the early 20th century, a secular movement and not a religious one?
It was a little bit of both, but it was, I would say, largely a secular one. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
I wonder, the fascination with Sharia law, is that going to win out in Islam itself?
The fascination continues. It continues in every Middle Eastern land about which I've talked and about which I know anything. I like that last question so much. I would say it's a little bit a part of the current Reformation, if one could apply that title to what's going on in the Middle East today. At the end of the day, so much of it is so overtly barbaric that I don't think it's going to make it. There is a fascination, but that's what it is, as there is a fascination with lots of inappropriate activities for human beings to engage in. So, 8:15, lots of talk about lots of different topics. You've been wonderful. Thank you.
70% of the tax was based on